Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, is one of the most disturbing and notorious serial killers in modern history. His gruesome crimes, spanning from 1978 to 1991, shocked the world. Dahmer murdered 17 young men and boys, many of whom he sexually assaulted, dismembered, and in some cases, cannibalized. His horrifying acts raised profound questions about the nature of evil, mental illness, societal failures, and the justice system. Jeffrey Dahmer's early life. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His early life was relatively uneventful, but as he grew older, it became clear that something was deeply wrong. As a child, Dahmer was described as quiet and shy. He showed little interest in socializing and struggled to make friends. By the time Dahmer reached adolescence, he began to exhibit disturbing behaviors. He developed a fascination with dead animals, collecting roadkill and dissecting it, which indicated an early morbid curiosity with death and anatomy. His home life was also troubled, with his parents often fighting, and his mother, Joyce, struggling with mental health issues. Dahmer began to drink heavily as a teenager, using alcohol to numb his emotional pain and confusion, particularly around his emerging homosexual desires. The combination of family instability, isolation, and his growing obsession with death laid the foundation for his later horrific crimes. First murder, Stephen Hicks, 1978. In the summer of 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from high school, Dahmer committed his first murder. His victim was Stephen Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker whom Dahmer lured to his family's home under the pretense of having drinks. After several hours together, Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell and then strangled him to death. He later dismembered the body, crushing the bones and scattering them in the woods behind his house. This murder marked the beginning of a downward spiral that Dahmer would not fully succumb to until years later. After the killing, Dahmer briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after one semester due to his excessive drinking. In 1979, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, but was discharged 2 years later for similar reasons. Despite the horrors he had committed, Dahmer managed to avoid detection and didn't kill again for almost 9 years. The Reign of Terror begins, 1987 to 1991. In 1987, Dahmer resumed his killing spree. His second victim was Stephen Toomey, a young man Dahmer met at a bar. Dahmer brought Toomey to a hotel room, where he claims to have killed him without recalling the actual act. The following morning, Dahmer found Toomey's lifeless body beside him. Panicked, Dahmer dismembered the corpse and disposed of it, much like he had with his first victim. This murder reignited Dahmer's dark compulsions, leading to a pattern that would define his subsequent killings. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer would kill 15 more victims, many of them young men of color. He lured his victims to his apartment under false pretenses, often offering money for photographs or companionship. Once there, Dahmer would drug them, murder them, and then carry out unspeakable acts on their bodies. Dahmer's method of operation became increasingly twisted. He engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism, consuming parts of his victims in an attempt to make them a part of him. His crimes escalated further when he began experimenting with chemical lobotomies. Dahmer drilled holes into his victims' skulls and injected acid or boiling water into their brains in an effort to create zombie-like compliant individuals. None of these horrific experiments were successful, and his victims eventually died. Conric Synthesomphone, a missed opportunity. One of the most tragic aspects of the Jeffrey Dahmer case was the police's failure to apprehend him earlier, despite a clear opportunity to do so. On May 27, 1991, Dahmer lured 14-year-old Conric Synthesomphone, a Laotian teenager, to his apartment. After drugging the boy and attempting one of his chemical lobotomies, Synthesomphone briefly escaped. He was found wandering the streets, naked and disoriented, by 2 women who immediately called the police. When officers arrived on the scene, Dahmer convinced them that Synthesomphone was his adult lover who simply had too much to drink. Despite the protests of the women, the police accepted Dahmer's story and allowed him to take the boy back to his apartment. Hours later, Synthesomphone was dead. This failure on the part of the police allowed Dahmer to continue his killing spree for several more months. The incident became a flashpoint in discussions about race, homosexuality, and police negligence, particularly because many of Dahmer's victims were people of color and from marginalized communities. Capture and arrest. July 1991. Jeffrey Dahmer's killing spree came to an abrupt end on July 22, 1991, when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Dahmer had lured Edwards to his apartment and attempted to handcuff him. However, Edwards fought back, escaped, and flagged down 2 police officers. Edwards led the police back to Dahmer's apartment, where they uncovered a horrific scene. Inside, the officers found photographs of dismembered bodies, human remains in the refrigerator, and various tools Dahmer had used to commit his murders. Dahmer was immediately arrested. Upon further investigation, police discovered that Dahmer had been meticulously documenting his crimes through photographs and journals, further revealing the extent of his horrifying actions. The trial, insanity plea, and conviction. Jeffrey Dahmer's trial began in January 1992. Given the overwhelming evidence against him, Dahmer's defense team entered a plea of guilty but insane. His attorneys argued that Dahmer's actions were the result of severe mental illness, pointing to his necrophilia, cannibalism, and his bizarre attempts to create zombie-like victims as evidence of his psychological disturbance. The prosecution, however, argued that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions and their criminal nature. They pointed to his methodical approach to murder, his efforts to avoid detection, and his ability to manipulate both his victims and the authorities. Ultimately, the jury rejected the insanity plea, finding Dahmer legally sane and guilty of all charges. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. Life in prison and death. After his conviction, Jeffrey Dahmer was sent to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Despite his notoriety, Dahmer appeared to adjust to life in prison. He expressed remorse for his actions during interviews, claiming that he had found religion and had been baptized while incarcerated. However, many remained skeptical of his purported transformation. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by fellow inmate Christopher Scarver while performing cleaning duties in the prison gymnasium. Scarver later revealed that he had been deeply disturbed by Dahmer's crimes and felt that Dahmer was unremorseful, even mocking other inmates with his behavior. Dahmer's violent end was seen by some as an inevitable outcome, given the hatred and infamy that surrounded him. Legacy and cultural impact. The crimes of Jeffrey Dahmer left a permanent scar on American society. His case forced the nation to grapple with questions about mental illness, the nature of evil, and the failures of law enforcement. The fact that many of Dahmer's victims were young men of color, combined with the police's mishandling of the Conrect Synthesum phone incident, sparked discussions about racism, homophobia, and systemic bias within the justice system. Dahmer's story has been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and TV shows, each examining the psychological, social, and cultural dimensions of his crimes. His case remains one of the most chilling examples of the depths of human depravity and continues to captivate the public's imagination. That's it for today's video. What do you think of our video? Please let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.